the survival decisions that matter more than tools. Before we begin, subscribe if you value survival lessons drawn from history rather than gear catalogues. Tools have always played a role in survival, but history is unambiguous about one thing. Decisions killed or saved people far more often than equipment ever did. Tools extend capability. Decisions determine whether that capability is used at the right moment or wasted entirely. Across wars, forced migrations, disasters, and wilderness survival, the people who lived longest were rarely the ones with the best equipment. They were the ones who made the least damaging decisions early, when mistakes were still recoverable. Survival was not decided in dramatic moments. It was decided quietly, through judgment calls that either reduced exposure or multiplied it. The first decision that mattered more than any tool was when to move and when to stop. History shows that movement killed more people than immobility. Soldiers marched into exhaustion because orders demanded it. Refugees walked until collapse because stopping felt like failure. Survivors understood that, rest preserved strength and prevented cascading mistakes. Tools could not restore energy once it was spent. Choosing to stop at the right time kept people alive longer than any piece of gear. Another decisive choice was route selection. People with maps, compasses, and supplies still died because they chose routes that exposed them to wind, cold, heat, or observation. Survivors chose terrain that offered cover, water access, and shelter potential even if it slowed progress. History repeatedly shows that the safest route is rarely the fastest. Tools assist navigation, decisions determine safety. Weather judgment was, honestly, another critical factor. History punished those who ignored weather signals. Storms, temperature drops, and wind shifts killed thousands who believed they could just push through with equipment. Survivors read clouds, wind, humidity, and even animal behavior, and adjusted plans accordingly. No tool can really compensate for ignoring weather. The decision to wait often mattered more than any shelter or clothing. Load management was, another life or death decision. People died carrying too much because they believed more tools equaled more security. But history shows the opposite. Overloaded soldiers exhausted themselves. Displaced civilians abandoned essentials when collapse came. Survivors, often chose mobility over possessions early on, not just when they were forced to. The decision to travel light, it preserved energy, reduced injury, and really helped maintain flexibility. Tools, honestly, weighed nothing compared to judgment. Fire decisions in the end mattered more than the fire tools themselves. History actually is full of people who had the means to start fires but made the wrong call about when and where to use them. Fires attracted attention, consumed fuel, and, increased risk. Survivors, had to decide whether fire was really worth the risk of exposure. Sometimes they used it just briefly, or maybe only indirectly, and in some cases not at all. Tools, of course, were essential to ignite fire. But in the end, it was their decisions that determined whether fire became an asset or, a liability. Shelter decisions, interestingly, followed pretty much the same pattern. Survivors had to choose their locations very carefully. They made sure to avoid low ground, wind funnels, and flood zones, and they always oriented their shelters based on the weather and the surrounding terrain. History, if we look at it, shows that a poorly placed shelter fails, no matter what materials were used. On the other hand, a well-placed one can succeed, even if it's quite crude. So in the end, the decision of where really mattered more than what it was made from. water management decisions often outweighed the value of water tools themselves. People actually died with their containers still full because they rationed incorrectly, pushed themselves too hard, or simply ignored the right timing for hydration. Survivors, on the other hand, learned to adjust their intake based on how hard they were working and the temperature around them. They really understood that dehydration could destroy judgment long before thirst ever became severe. No filtration system, no matter how advanced, can actually fix poor water discipline. At the end of the day, the decision to drink correctly mattered so much more than the container you carried. Perhaps the most overlooked decision was knowing when to abandon a plan. History shows us that rigidly sticking to original plans has cost lives. Survivors adapted early. They recognized when conditions had changed enough to invalidate their assumptions, and, well, they changed course. Equipment, often locked people into rigid plans. But knowledge and judgment, well, those freed them from such constraints. In the end, survival really favored those who treated plans as temporary, not something sacred. Social decisions, they also mattered quite a bit. People who isolated themselves unnecessarily, they often failed. On the other hand, those who cooperated, shared labor, and pooled their knowledge, they tended to last much longer. History shows us that survival was rarely a solo achievement. In fact, the decision to work with others often mattered more than individual skill or tools. Another critical choice was psychological management. Panic, false confidence, and denial destroyed decision-making. Survivors, well, they controlled tempo, avoided emotional spikes, and focused on small, manageable actions. Tools do nothing for morale or judgment. History shows that calm decision-making under pressure was honestly one of the strongest survival assets available. Applying these lessons today means shifting focus away from accumulation and toward judgment. Ask not what tools you have, but what decisions you would make under fatigue, fear, and uncertainty. So, practice deciding when to stop, when to move, when to wait, and when to change plans. And, it's important to learn to recognize when exposure is increasing rather than decreasing. Tools are, really important. History never denied that. But tools only matter when they're guided by sound decisions. Without judgment, tools just become, weight, noise, and honestly, a source of false confidence. Survival has always been, in a way, decided long before the emergency ever felt dramatic. It was settled in those quiet moments when people chose restraint over urgency and thought over impulse. If this perspective resonates, go ahead and subscribe to Strange History and share this with anyone who believes survival is just about owning the right gear. History tells a harder truth, and it's one that still saves lives today.